Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. And today we are talking about Beyond BizTalk, the future of on-premises integration. So as you know, in the recent webinars we've been running, we have been talking about BizTalk migration. We were also talking about the move to cloud and what BizTalk applications might look like in the cloud. What we're going to talk about today is particularly for people that come from an on-premises integration background. It's like, what does the future hold? The world, there probably isn't a time since at least possibly the introduction of .NET where this world isn't being shaken up quite as much as it is now. So we're going to talk about what all this means for you, particularly if you're living in the world of integration. So in terms of today's webinar, I mean, we're assuming you're here because you're familiar with BizTalk or integration as a subject and you're interested in technology trends. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick tour of some of the key technology concepts that are shaping integration. We are going to recap on some of the recent announcements from Microsoft that give us clues to where they are heading. And also we're going to explore what this means for you and the sort of the wider world of integration. In terms of presenters, I'm Andrew Rivers. I'm a director of 345 Technology. We help you build your business on data. And I'm joined by Dan Probert, CTO of Afinis, and Dan is a cloud expert, knowledgeable about all things in the integration world and and the leading expert in the world on Azure integration services. So really pleased to have Dan joining us. And Dan, would you like to say hello?
Hello, Andrew. Thank you very much. I cannot honestly call me expert in anything in case I get something wrong.
Yeah, but it just means other people would have got two things wrong.
Yeah.
That's what it means. So just take the win. Okay, and these webinars are brought to you by Azure Integration Group, which is an initiative it was originally started by our two companies, which is just to share information and best practice on Microsoft integration. And in particular, we've been looking at the problem of moving people off on-premises BizTalk into AIS. And what we do is we help, if you're a company that's a BizTalk customer, we help you migrate into Azure. If you're a consultancy that works with BizTalk customers, then we help you to help your customers. So we do both of those, and always willing to share information. And if you need help with training or whatever, we can just help you with that. And but as with these webinar series, where we are just always happy to just share what we know, kind of engage with everyone out there, and just be part of the community. So diving straight in. Basic concepts. So, well, do you want to start on this one, Dan, or should I? Containers. Just so to say, it's like.
I think I'll let you talk about them, but I think maybe we should just explain why we're going through some of this, because the title of this presentation today obviously is the future of AIS on premises. So there's certain things we know that we can't talk about. There's certain things we don't know, and all we can do is extrapolate. But what we're trying to do today is give you a view of where we think things are going based on everything we can read that Microsoft is saying. So all the stuff they're putting out, all the tools they're putting out, all the articles they put out, you can sort of get an idea of where they're heading. So what we wanted to do is, because we know that a lot of people that will be listening to this and that we work with are either BizTalk people or they're AIS people. And if you're a BizTalk person, you're probably not dealing much with the cloud. You know what it is. If you're a cloud person, you're dealing with AIS. But unless you've come from a background of, say, Service Fabric or microservices or something like that, or you're heavily in the Linux world or something like that, you might not be familiar with how containers work and what they are. So we wanted to just give you a background on some key concepts that we'll be talking about in today's presentation. And we're going to start with a couple of them here, because when we start talking about containerization, we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
That's a great way to start. I'm glad you said that, because it's probably worth the extra, the extra 2 minutes. So what is a container? I mean, unless you've been living in a cave, you've probably at least heard of Docker, and Docker is the original kind of thing of building containers. And the idea of container is that there are various ways to describe containers, but effectively it's a way of running of isolating the running of an application from everything else that's running on that machine, whether it be a virtual machine or whether it be a physical machine. Each of those machines has an operating system, and that operating system has access to the disk, and it has access to IO and network and CPU and all those sort of things. In a container, all that stuff is hidden from you, and all you can do really is just run your application. But what you also get in the container is you get all the bits of the operating system that are needed to run the application. So shared libraries, a host that can run. So for example, like Node containers will be running Node, and then .NET Core containers will have a .NET Core runtime. Java containers will have the Java virtual machine. So it gives you everything to run an application, but just about nothing else. And then that's the first thing is talking about containers. And another important thing then is to talk about Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is an open source platform which helps you manage containers, because when you've built your application in a container, it's great. We all love that. But what do you do with it? How do you then take that application, package it, deploy it, run it, scale it across multiple machines, make it resilient? If one machine dies, how do you make sure it fires up on another one? So all that sort of stuff is what Kubernetes does for you. So and we've got this little diagram here. So in a traditional deployment, you've got hardware, you run an operating system, and you run apps on that as processes. When we virtualize that, we obviously have the operating system has a hypervisor such as Hyper-V, and then we run operating systems, and then you kind of have that sort of stack on top of it again. So you have your libraries and you have your apps running side by side, and they can see each other, and they're all hosts in the process. Whereas when we go to containers, we would be running the container runtime such as Kubernetes, and then within that, each of those applications is isolated. But I suppose the thing that is even bigger than this picture of container deployment is that what happens when you've got multiple machines, even multiple machines in multiple clouds that are all interacting together to make a highly scalable application. And that is what we're talking about here with Kubernetes.
That's really cool. So I guess one thing I could ask, Andrew, is, let's say I had a simple distributed application where I've got a database, and then I've got some business logic, and then I've got a web app at the front end of some sort. So you're saying that I would deploy those as 3 containers, most likely, that make up an application?
So it's a typical thing for a container is to run literally one process.
Okay.
So if you've got an A might be a process. If you've got a web app like an ASP.NET MVC, that will be one process. So that would be a separate container usually, and because usually you only have one port that's open on a container. Mm-hmm. One process is in it on one port. And obviously one of the other things that Kubernetes gives you is all the networking, so that you can route requests into that container, because because you don't necessarily know which machine it's going to be running on. So a request comes in, and how do you route that? So it looks after that. So you might have databases running. So you might have a database container, you might have an API container, you might have a web front end container. But those 3 things together may form an application, or they may form a microservice, and so you still need to coordinate those things together. But but each of those could, each, just the way I look at it is, generally speaking, if it's a separate process, if on a traditional deployment, you'd see it as a separate line in your separate process running on your operating system, that would probably be a separate container. Okay. Because each of those processes you need to isolate the dependencies for each one of those separately.
And I guess the cool thing about containers is that because you're now decoupled from the operating system and there's no VMs or anything like that, I can put that container on any container runtime that supports that container. So that container runtime could be on-prem, it could be in the cloud, it could be in someone else's cloud, it could be. So once I've created my container, say running my my APIs, it doesn't matter where I deploy that.
That's true. I mean, obviously with caveats. So one of the things you do by including in your container all the binaries and libraries that you need to run that application, that behaves the same everywhere you run it. So you do, so the application will perform the same. Now you still need to inject configuration into that because your production one might be configured slightly differently from your test, from your development, but the application itself, in terms of its executable stack, will be exactly the same.
Okay, and what would maybe an alternative to Kubernetes be? So if I'm trying to help people understand how you conceptualize these things, because that's the most important thing for in my view. When I had to learn about containers and management and things like that, I first of all tried to equate them to things that I understood. Somebody once told me, well, a container is a bit like a VM. I'm like, well, it's not. And then someone said, well, container's a bit like a zip file. I'm like, well, it kind of is, but it's also kind of not. It's almost like there's nothing to compare it to. It's something new. So if we think about Kubernetes, if you think about what other platforms exist for, say, hosting containers or managing containers besides Kubernetes?
Well, there are. There are other container hosts. So Docker itself will act as a container host. You also have in Azure, you've got Azure Container Instances. So you can actually have a separate thing in Azure that just hosts a container as an API. Similarly, that on AWS, there's something called Elastic Beanstalk that you can use to just host a container. But those, generally speaking, those three things are all generally just hosting one type of container at a time, and it's all a bit piecemeal. So there is nothing else really. I'm just dreading all the flack that's going to come in if we make any bold statements, but there's nothing else really compares to Kubernetes as something that brings it all together at an application level to say, okay, all these containers here all form an application, and I want to manage them together as an application. I want to scale them independently, put them across different machines. I can have a policy so that I've got to meet, that any instance is running across at least 2 or 3 machines, etc., etc. Those sort of things. There's nothing else really that I know of that kind of has that operational richness that Kubernetes has.
Okay, so I guess in the microservices world, it's similar to what Service Fabric did.
Yeah, I mean, obviously. So exactly that. So Service Fabric was, is it a bit harsh to say that Kubernetes kind of killed Service Fabric because it was better?
Do we know any Service Fabric devs anymore looking for work?
So Service Fabric was kind of doing that stuff, but it just as with all these things, kind of in a survival of the fittest kind of way, that Kubernetes has kind of conquered all before it because it's just done it more comprehensively and just better.
Yeah,
and also because Kubernetes is open source platform independent, it doesn't have the the sort of the vendor baggage that maybe Service Fabric had.
I can see someone's commented that some alternatives to Kubernetes would be things like OpenShift or Docker Swarm. So there are other orchestration platforms out there.
Yeah, so interestingly, OpenShift is Kubernetes under the bonnet.
Okay.
So it's a bit like it's by Red Hat. So like how Red Hat takes something that's free, Linux, and then put their distro on it and then make you pay for it.
Yeah.
They've done the same thing. They've done the same thing for Kubernetes. It's like saying, let's take something free and then charge you for
Red
it.
Hat's calling. They want to talk to you.
But the reason why people might find that appealing is that you get support for it. Then it's then a supported thing. So so sorry, Red Hat's not all bad. But Docker Swarm, yes. Although again, it's as far as I'm as far as I'm aware, it just hasn't quite had. Docker Swarm just hasn't quite had the against his head. So
okay.
Anyway, cool. So I think we've kind of done the containers.
We've done the orchestrator aspect. So I guess we've talked about containers and how we host them, and now we can start to talk about, well, once you've got that infrastructure, what can you start running on top of it, or what are the other applications, open source things that can help you when you're running your applications?
Yeah. So let's go on to the next slide, and so the next one is really, and this is causing, this is DAPR. So DAPR is causing a lot of people to pause and think, mostly because very few people understand it. So, Dan, do you want to give us a quick 2 minutes on DAPR?
Yeah.
It's like, where do you start?
More than 2 minutes. Okay. So what is DAPR? It's a runtime engine. It's an open source, it says here, it's an open source event-driven runtime from microservices. That's what it is. It provides things like state management and event management and a whole of other things for microservices. And DAPR's loaded, for Kubernetes at least, DAPR's loaded as a sidecar. So you can, if you've got a service running in a container, if you've got a service running in a container on Kubernetes, DAPR can provide services, additional services for your service running in the container, for example, state management. And because it's loaded as a sidecar and because it's modular driven, there are additional things we can load into DAPR as well. And we're going to talk about that when we come to talk about logic apps. In a nutshell, that's what it is. So it's providing additional services to your microservices or your services running in a container.
Excellent. And also the other thing we've got on here is to talk about, again, I mean, that was a very, very quick introduction to DAPR. I've put the link in the thing, but it's a big topic. And similarly, Azure Arc. I mean, this is a really exciting thing, but again, also a big topic. But this and Azure Arc was in the keynote for Ignite last year, and so basically, it's one of the things that people have found as a problem is when you've got a lot of cloud resources, it's how you manage them, isn't it? So, what's Azure Arc doing differently that we can't do right now?
Well, I guess the thing is, so first of all, just to back up a little bit, it was quite a surprise when Satya got up on stage at Ignite and announced Azure Arc. People weren't expecting it. And I guess the thing is that Microsoft are thinking big with this because they're thinking, okay, so if I'm in the cloud, I'm not just going to be in Azure. If you go to any large enterprise, they're going to have multiple cloud providers. So they have a bit of AWS and a bit of maybe a bit of IBM and maybe a bit of Google and a bit of Azure as well. And then you'll have on-prem as well. And then you'll have multiple different services running there. So you might have all your servers and your VMs running various applications. And then you've got Kubernetes running somewhere or some other orchestrator with all your containers. And what is needed is something that gives you an overview of all of that and makes the management and operations of all of that easier. So we have these concept of operation plane and control planes when we start talking about containerization in the cloud, and it provides a single plane for seeing all your resources regardless of where they are and wherever they're deployed. So, as it says, it centrally organizes and governs anything. So a Windows server, a Linux server, whether that's VM or on-prem, data center, doesn't matter. Your Kubernetes clusters, and it does it across any cloud you're using it on, data centers, edge. So you can use Azure Arc with AWS, for example, if you've got containers running on Kubernetes on there. It's a really interesting idea, and you can understand why they're going in this direction because, Azure started off as we want everyone to get off-prem and onto the cloud, and then we'll manage everything inside the portal. Nice. But now we've got these new technologies where we realize that actually not everyone wants to move off-prem, and some people also want to have multiple clouds. That's just the reality. So if you want to support customers in that way, then the best way of doing it is providing them an overview of everything they've got, one place to manage everything, and that's what they're going with. I mean, I know one client who they have a system where they can inject containers into whatever cloud is offering the best prices that day, because it doesn't matter. You can just spin them up wherever, because the services are they're already containerized. So all you're doing is deploying the containers to the appropriate cluster in a particular cloud, and they'll switch off and on wherever is cheaper, because different cloud providers have different prices or different discounts at different times. So the other thing too here is this idea of the edge. So IoT is really, really important. So this is something we haven't really talked about in any of our presentations here. It's not something that people with BizTalk really talk about. There used to be, I don't know how many customers are still running the cut down version of BizTalk that you sort of run at the edge. But when we start talking about IoT and we have resources or services that are running on, you know, smaller devices running on the edge somewhere, you need a way of managing all those as well. And Arc provides this single plane for seeing all of that and managing all of that. It's a brilliant idea if Microsoft can pull it off. But I guess if anyone is going to, it's going to be them. Yeah,
certainly it's a brilliant vision, but it still hasn't quite, you know, it still hasn't quite materialized. But yeah, certainly it's one of those things that you know, it's like you say, when Microsoft announced Azure in 2008, probably no one really thought at the time just what a world of complexity we were going to end up with. So
no, not at all.
So it's sort of a, you know, it's arisen from need rather than anything else. Okay, so we've covered those basic concepts. That's all. That stuff is really important things that, you know, everyone that's working in tech needs to know, because these, you know, even these four things we just mentioned here: containers, Kubernetes, distributed, you know, DAPR, and Azure Arc. You know, they're all changing the world right now. So, you know, we're looking at this from an integration angle. So the context is, you know, we're talking about what's happened with AIS on premises. So obviously, originally, you know, everyone's heard of Azure Stack, which was a way of, you know, a more expensive way of buying Azure by putting it in your, by putting it in your own data center.
That is very true. I remember a conversation with one of the program managers for Service Bus back in the day, talking about when was Service Bus coming to Azure Stack. You know, everyone was excited about running Azure locally because, you know, everyone's got clients that don't want to move to the cloud. Maybe they've got data security issues, or maybe there's legislation that prevents them from doing it, or something like that. And so they're like, well, how are we going to get Azure on-prem? We know that the future of integration is Azure, whatever that looks like, but how do we have that on-prem? And Azure Stack was the story at the time. But everyone knew that once you're running on-prem, it's much more difficult for Microsoft to make money out of it. So the idea, I understand, was that things would be a little bit more expensive running on-prem. Azure Stack requires you to have certified hardware to run it, and once it's running, it's indistinguishable from running in Azure, but they prefer you to be running in Azure.
Yeah. So that was where AIS was originally going to go, and now we look at Microsoft. I mean, Microsoft aren't making any secret of their love for containers. I mean, and it goes right. You know, this isn't just in the integration world, but generally, you know, they bought into Docker. They bought into Docker in a big way. That it's not, you know, it's not a secret. They've been shouting this pretty loudly.
Yeah.
And obviously, containers allow us to package code in a container. And for that container,
bit of recursion there.
Yeah, it's more alliteration, I think, but or it might not be. I'm not used to doing grammar on the fly. So obviously, one of the things we can do with containers, we can deploy them to any system, which could be any cloud or local, like we said, and as long as there's the container hosting runtime that's supporting that, then we don't actually care.
Yep. Exactly.
And as we just said, so we've got this far, and it's like, well, Microsoft's embracing containers. They're putting all their code in containers, so it can be deployed anywhere. Kubernetes allows us to orchestrate the container deployment. And Azure Arc, they've got something to monitor those containers, whether they're in the cloud or on-prem. So guess what? You know, from this, we can, you know, although I'm not sure if it's actually been stated in terms of AAS, but I think we can presume. I think we've got a pretty good guess that the direction of Azure Integration Services on-prem is containers.
Yeah, I mean, there's already clues out there. So as we'll talk about in a little minute, that at Integrate this year, Matt Farmer, I think John Fancy did as well, talked about this preview of Logic Apps, the next version of Logic Apps V2 running on Azure Functions, and they've made no secret about the fact that you can actually run Azure Functions in a Docker container. So that would mean that you could run your Logic app in a Docker container. There's a lot of questions I have around all of this, because now you've got your Logic app running in a container. How do you interact with it? How do you manage it? How do you deploy to it? That sort of thing. But it's really, really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So that's our context, and the other thing we're going to look at is the challenges we're looking to solve.
Yes.
So So as we know, when we build applications, obviously there's the development of them. So that has its own particular challenges, and currently things like Logic Apps, it's a bit quirky and it's a bit different. So what are the key things you wanted to pull out from that one, Dan, in terms of design time and deployment time but particularly for the people that come from BizTalk to where they are now in AIS and then where they're going in the future?
Well, I guess the thing is that if you look at how BizTalk is today, it's fairly well-known development. I mean, yes, there's a steep learning curve, but we fire up Visual Studio, we create a BizTalk project, we start creating our orchestrations, our schemas, our maps, we create a binding file, and then we can deploy to BizTalk directly from Visual Studio. So bang, there we go. There's our development is well supported. It's tricky at times. We've got good support for inline C# or writing C# classes and calling them, and there's difficult things to do, but there we go. Deployment. So when we move to a DevOps style deployment or automated deployment, things become a bit harder with BizTalk. There are various frameworks to help us with that. So there are extensions for MS Build that let us take our code and package it and deploy it. And then there's things like the BizTalk deployment framework, which do the same thing. Let us take our code, our assemblies, our binding files, SSO settings, things like that, package them into an MSI and run a script to deploy automatically to BizTalk. With the complexity of deployment for BizTalk is that you might be on a BizTalk server group with 8 or 9 host instances, I should say. So effectively 9 computers, servers that we're deploying to. We have to deploy to all of those consistently. It used to be difficult to do CI and CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment with BizTalk. Now it's less so. There's more tools in BizTalk 2016 and BizTalk 2020 to support that out of the box. Plus you can use things like the deployment framework to do that. And then BizTalk Runtime, easy enough. We've installed BizTalk, it runs. And then support and maintenance, there's tools out there to use. You can use BizTalk 360, you can use the admin console, there's various other tools you can use as well. So the on-prem story for BizTalk today is well established. Now, the on-prem story...
Although what we can say, and one of the things we perhaps could have put on here is testing as well.
Yes, testing.
Let's not forget the testers.
It's somebody else's job.
Yes, Andy. Yeah, because testing is actually quite opaque in BizTalk. I mean, you can test schemas, you can test maps, you can unit test pipelines, but orchestrations need to run in the runtime, and so unit testing those is very difficult, because you actually have to you can't test them at design time. You actually have to test them at runtime.
Yes, that's very, very true. Okay, so if we think there that that's the on-prem today with BizTalk. Now, when we move to AIS in Azure, the story becomes simpler and harder. So development of Logic Apps, you can, oh look, testing's magically appeared.
It was there all along.
The demo gods heard me. Or presentation gods, webinar gods. The development of Logic Apps, you have 2 options. You can develop in the portal, and that's pretty cool. You go and use the design room in the portal. It has its quirks. Certain things you have to drop out to code view and editing JSON files. But it's tricky to know how to do development in an enterprise scenario where I've got my code and I want to put it in source control, and now I want to do CI and CD with it. You know, that's a
or how are two developers working on this and they need to merge their changes together?
Well, exactly right. So although you have Logic App tools for Visual Studio, they have their own foibles. They're tricky at times. And effectively what you can do is it lets you have a local ARM template, which you can open in the editor locally and make certain changes to. I noticed that in Visual Studio Code, it's read-only, whereas if you in Visual Studio, at least you can make changes to it. But almost every organization that I've worked with that's doing Logic Apps development, what they tend to do is do their development in the portal, bring down the Logic App as an ARM template, parameterize it, and then put it in source control so it can be automated. The deployment and testing can be automated. And then if you've got major changes, you tend to do that back in the portal again and then try and merge those in.
But anyways, that's a bit back to front, isn't it? Because you're almost like editing it, deploying it in, you're sort of saving it in the cloud, and then exporting it and then putting it in source control. Yes. And it's a really kind of back to front kind of development experience.
It is an ass backwards way of doing it, and I think and there's a lot of challenges with it. The parameterization is quite a big one, because you end up, when you take your Logic App from the portal and you use a tool to download it as an ARM template, or you export it, you end up with a lot of hard-coded references, which means that that Logic App will only run in that resource group connected to that API connection, blah, blah, blah. So there are tools out there. Jeff Holland created a tool, and I'm so sorry, I've forgotten his name. The MVP that's now maintaining the tool, I will find that out and mention them. We'll put a link up. There's a tool you can download. It's a command line tool that will bring your Logic App down as an ARM template and then parameterize it for you. So that's pretty cool as well. And so that makes things easier, but it's still not as easy as, say, doing C# development or BizTalk development. It's harder. There's friction in your development. Now, testing of Logic Apps is an interesting one, because on the surface, testing is easier. If I've got a Logic App that has an HTTP trigger, I can just, use Postman to call it. Easy. But hold on, what if that Logic App's connecting to Salesforce, for example? How do I mock out Salesforce? Well, you can't at the moment. There's not great mocking support in Logic Apps. It's starting to come. And so the recommendation that you have is generally that you go through APIM, so then you can mock out APIM and test your Logic Apps as a black box. But it's not great story today. I mean, BizTalk's not great either. How many times have you been asked to test an orchestration and isolation? You're like, well, I can't. I can test an end-to-end flow and treat BizTalk as a black box, or my flow as a black box. It's difficult to do the equivalent of unit testing. I mean, even a tool like BizUnit, although it's not really a unit test, it's an end-to-end test for a flow. And so with Logic Apps, you end up doing a similar thing. Now, you can make things better in Logic Apps by designing your Logic Apps such that they're discrete pieces, and we showed this in our demo last week, that if I'm receiving a file using the file system connector, and then I'm transforming it and validating it and then writing it out as a file, I can separate that into 3 separate Logic Apps, or even 4, so that the receiving the file is separate from the Logic App that actually does the transformation and validation, which is separate from the Logic App that might write out the file at the end. And then I can test the middle part on its own. So the more you can put into Logic Apps that can be called independently from the connectors, the better, because then you can test those parts without having to actually go through dropping a file and things like that. Because for your automated testing, that's what you want. You want to be able to effectively test a Logic App in isolation. Mocking support would really help with that. But deployment, well, Logic Apps, if you're in the portal, there's no deployment. It's just there. The thing with deployment is when you're have your logic apps templates sitting in source control, so for example DevOps, we then need to automate the deployment of those. And the difficulty there is there's multiple ways of doing it. We have to have parameter files if you're using them. The parameterization of logic apps is tricky. But once you've got it all set up, it tends to work quite well. So there's a known story for deployment of Azure resources. And in fact, in some ways, it's easier than BizTalk. And then there's the runtime. Well, that's sorted for you. You don't need to worry about servers or VMs or anything like that. You don't have to worry about SQL Server or anything like that. Once you've deployed those iPaaS resources, Azure looks after all that for you. And then important maintenance is, I think it's still early days. It's not as easy. If you think about BizTalk out of the box doesn't have a lot for support maintenance. There is stuff there, but it's why there's room for tools like BizTalk 360, because there's a need for, say, alerts on things or grouping together various applications in BizTalk and alerting when certain things happen. Logic apps and AIS and Azure have something different. We have App Insights and Azure monitoring and all the rest, but there's nothing given to you out of the box that's easy to use. It's not like I can apply a template and say, this will look after all my logic apps and my my Service Bus namespaces and my storage and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it isn't really pulled together in quite the same way. Although
no, it's getting better.
It's getting better, and it's not out there. So okay, so we've looked at the challenges now. So I think probably the future stuff we'll just hang fire on that for just a second, and we'll just so let's just recap on those announcements that we were talking about. So we've set the scene now, and so the announcements that have been made this year, and they all came at the Integrate conference really, and those are that Logic Apps is well, it's available now for preview on the Azure Functions runtime, and the preview uses Visual Studio Code and allows you to run your Logic Apps locally, which you could never do before. So that's quite a, in itself, that's pretty groundbreaking, isn't it?
Oh, that's huge. Yes. So up until now, I could run my Logic app up in Azure, and I have no idea. I supply a JSON file in an ARM template that describes my Logic app, and that's it. It's just run for me. But the fact it's running on functions is really interesting, because for the first time, I could fire up, Visual Studio Code and author a Logic app locally and run it locally, and then I can package it up to run wherever I can run Azure Functions.
Yeah, and so the second one is kind of, I mean, these Logic Apps on DAPR. Which again is, Logic Apps is another, obviously Logic Apps is, underneath it, it's still just an application runtime. And so there is also, a preview of Logic Apps running on DAPR. Now this one to me is a little bit more, so whilst we know that DAPR is this great thing that kind of really enriches what we can do with containers and enriches what we can do with like microservices. What would you say are the really significant parts of, what's significant about Logic Apps on DAPR?
Well, this is kind of interesting, because there hasn't been a lot about this. So it was mentioned at Integrate, and I'm pretty sure there was an announcement that came out just before Integrate about it through the DAPR team, and you can go and download it all and play with it. But not a lot has been said by Microsoft in terms of how they're intending to integrate this. Yeah,
because even the announcement to Integrate, it was kind of blink and you've missed it, wasn't it? It was just like
exactly right.
Oh, Logic Apps on DAPR,
and
then on with the next thing, and it was just sort of thrown out there as like almost matter of factly, but it's actually, there must be something quite deep behind this. But
well, at a guess, so I haven't played too heavily with it, but at a guess, these two are related in some way, in that I imagine that it's probably Logic Apps on functions running with DAPR is probably what it is. And DAPR as a sidecar provides things like state management and event management and things like that. So if I'm running my Logic app in a container on functions, I imagine that I've then got DAPR providing me with state management and event management I can use with Logic Apps. There's another thing here. gRPC is a much faster communication mechanism than HTTP, and DAPR supports that. So I imagine that provides me with another way, instead of using the HTTP connector with Logic Apps, I now have gRPC as well. So it opens up the ability to connect, to basically to orchestrate our Logic Apps. It's the wrong word, but it's the only thing I can come up with at the moment. To orchestrate various Logic Apps all together into an application. And I think personally that what we'll probably end up seeing is somehow these two will work together in some way.
Yeah, because it's interesting. One of the things we talked about last time was because we started building Logic App, in the building Logic Apps live, still available on the on the Azure Integration Group website or the Azure Integration Group YouTube. So check that one out if you didn't see it. But one of the things we did last time was we created a Logic App and then we broke it down into different components and then had Logic Apps calling each one, and each different Logic Apps working together. But ultimately a Logic App is a microservice, and or a Logic App could be treated as a component within a microservice. But there is no concept of grouping them together to say, okay, these number of Logic Apps actually form an application. These form a service. There's no way of really doing that at the moment, is there?
No. There's no way today of trying to orchestrate all those parts together. No.
Okay, so the last announcement, obviously, and we've been talking about this quite a bit later, but there's also BizTalk Migrator, or the BizTalk migration tool. So again, Microsoft has said in fall 2020, which could mean next month, or it could mean, or it could mean in 3 months' time. We're not entirely sure, but Microsoft are releasing a tool which will take a BizTalk application and convert it into to run natively on Azure, using Logic Apps and other aspects of Azure integration services. We don't know much about it. There was an announcement in June. Since then, there's been radio silence. But there was quite a lot of information released, and we've been unpacking that over the last few weeks. So having set the scene with the recent announcements, I mean, so we're talking about Logic Apps and the specific aspects of how they could or should be improved. So I suppose what we can do really is, okay, what does this mean for design time experience on Logic Apps? What all this stuff we've been talking about, the DAPR, the running on the functions runtime, design, the Visual Studio Code preview. So if you're designing Logic Apps, how's that going to be affected?
Well, I think that the first thing is severing the connection needed back to Azure. Anyone that's worked with Logic Apps locally today in Visual Studio knows that before you can actually author the Logic App or make changes to it, you have to anchor it in a resource group. And the reason for that is that if I say, for example, inside a Logic App, I say I want to add a new file system connector, it needs an API connection, because it needs to know, the designer needs to know where are all the details for that file system that I'm connecting to, and that's held in an API connection. So it needs access back to Azure to look up the API for the file system and to find all the parameters needed to populate the screens and everything like that. So it's not a completely standalone thing. You need to say what resource group that Logic App's in. So it's not completely local development. You end up with a file that you can deploy, but the design time experience isn't perfect. If we're running on top of functions, everything's completely local. You shouldn't need any connection. You could do this on an airplane. So this is one of the things that gets me. If you were flying around and you had no connection to the internet, heaven forbid, you can't do Logic Apps development at the moment. Whereas this would allow you to do it.
Or you wouldn't be running microservices that your Airbus depended on in Azure. Would you? To be fair, you want them running locally. So that's a good point. Okay, so if we're running on the functions framework locally, then the design time experience means that we can encapsulate all that application locally, and we don't need to hook back into anything in Azure. And like I say, that is actually a big deal.
It is.
So the next thing is obviously DevOps and application packaging, because we've talked about this whole thing that really what happens in Azure is you save your Logic app into Azure, and then you have to export it, and you take it, out of Azure into your local machine, and then you do all some munging to make it a template, and then you can put it in your source control, and then you can put it in your DevOps. So it's a bit of a tortuous process. I suppose when you're as skilled as Dan at this, that becomes a thing. But for most people, it seems like a lot of tax on your activity to have to go and do that.
It is. There's a lot there, and so one of the things to talk a little bit about is that when we go to Azure, we've got to deal with ARM. So if I'm writing a Logic app, you've got the Logic app definition, the JSON that describes the Logic app, and then surrounding that, I've got the ARM template stuff. Now,
so
if you're running,
so what you're actually doing is you don't have, because previously, if you're writing a program code, for example, you write your program and then you package that code in some other way. But those two things are separate, so that whether you're going, so if you're going to package an assembly as part of a big wider application, or you're going to put it in a NuGet package, or that's a separate thing to actually writing your code, whereas it's all munged together at the moment.
Yes, that's exactly right. Whereas from what I understand, when you're doing Logic apps development on the Azure Functions, it's just the Logic app. And in fact, if you go to the sample pages for DAPR on Logic apps on DAPR, it's just the workflow. It's the central part that makes up the workflow. So that makes things a lot easier, especially for DevOps, because we're not dealing with ARM anymore. The Logic app is running on top of Azure, so all you're doing is deploying. Is running on top of a function. So all you're doing is making sure you're deploying the function's runtime, or deploying your function to a scenario that supports Azure Functions. And in fact, your Logic app, from what I understand, is probably running as a function.
So obviously massive changes afoot in the application packaging, performance and speed. So again, at the moment, I keep on inadvertently hopping around on this thing. Apologies for that. So at the moment, have you just added testing?
I might have just added testing, yes.
Right, okay.
Well, you might just magically appear.
Well, it did. Right at the moment, I thought I was clicking on something else.
So, this is a really important thing to talk about, because suddenly we're running locally. I'm hosting my Azure function runtime locally. I don't know how many people here have done functions development locally, but it's brilliant when you download the function tools, Azure function tools, and the runtime. I can run and debug my function locally. I just run it. I hit F5 and off I go. I imagine the same thing's going to apply to Logic apps. I can debug into my Logic app, and that means testing becomes so much easier. Now I can test my Logic app locally without having to deploy it, and that's one of the biggest issues with Logic apps at the moment, is that in the portal, you're not only developing. When you click save, you're deploying. If I'm running locally,
and you're back to the orchestration thing of you've got the same problems with orchestrations, that you're actually running it in the runtime rather than testing the code.
Yes, exactly right. So I believe that running locally, at least running on top of Azure Functions, is going to make testing a lot easier. Well, it's going to open up scenarios for testing.
Yeah, and okay, so just conscious that we need to kind of crack through some. But performance and speed. I mean, this is another big one, because again, when you run a Logic app, basically is because Logic apps is part of the whole serverless thing, which means that Azure allocates a machine for your Logic app to run at, and within the region that it's at, it can be in any, it can be anywhere, and it communicates with other Logic apps via HTTP. But effectively it's quite chatty, and between the Logic apps, you're I mean, first of all, they're kind of they're not compiled. They're more interpreted at runtime, but also behind the scenes, there's just tons and tons of HTTP connections going on behind the scenes to make them actually happen. And so you may have noticed with logic apps that they can be quite slow. So what impact will this have on speed?
I think it'll be huge. I'm not clear. Logic apps, as far as I'm aware, up in the cloud is more interpreted than compiled. I don't know whether on the functions runtime if that's the same, but I'm making an assumption that you compile down into a function. And if that's the case, then we should see huge improvements in speed. I mean, everyone remembers back in the day when you were working with Visual Basic as an interpreted language versus compiled, or even an XSLT, if you're writing a map in BizTalk, compiling it makes it so much faster. So I imagine that we would see huge increases in the speed of a single logic app. Whether or not that translates to the same improvement across a whole lot of logic apps running together, I don't know. But I would expect dramatic increases in speed and decreases in latency.
Yeah, and I think that's a really significant thing, and perhaps that gRPC thing that you talked about in DAPR, that might have some, that might be where that's coming in.
Yeah.
Because the ability of logic apps behind the scenes to connect to themselves via that type of remote procedure call rather than HTTP might actually make a big difference.
Well, now we're talking about low latency. I mean, even BizTalk's not great at low latency. You can get it there, but if you're wanting to talk about 1 or 2 milliseconds performance.
BizTalk's not going to get that sort of low latency, is it?
Mm.
So the pricing model. So again, as we talked about, I think we talked about this last week or the week before, but the pricing model for logic apps is per action. And obviously, if you find that your logic apps are running on functions in a container, then it goes more to a compute consumption model probably. Although we don't, again, this is us speculating now, I suppose. But is there anything else in terms of the pricing model that you can see that might change for logic apps?
Well, I don't know how Microsoft are going to price it when you're running on-prem. If I'm running a logic app in a container on a Kubernetes cluster that I've set up, how are they going to charge me for that? Unless they're charging you for use of management tools on top of that or something like that. So I don't know. I really don't know. I'm really interested to see how they're going to handle pricing, because there does need to be some level of pricing.
Yeah, and this is something, by the way, that this isn't one of the things that we know secret stuff and we're not telling you. We've got no idea about this sort of thing. So.
In fact, Microsoft might not know either. As you might have noticed, when Microsoft release things, they release it for free and preview in Azure, whilst they work out how they're going to charge for it. That seems to be the model they follow. So I imagine this will be something similar. It'll be like, well, here it is, and we'll tell you later how much it's going to cost you once everyone starts using it.
Yeah. Okay. So just calling out just kind of calling out some of the main points then. So logic apps run on the Azure Functions Runtime then. So the Functions Runtime, we haven't really said an awful lot about what it is, but I suppose the significant things are that we believe that we're probably going to be able to compile logic apps. We're going to get increased performance, and just let's talk a little bit about thinking about the option of stateful or stateless.
Yes, because people probably don't realize this, but when you're running logic apps in Azure, it's all stateful. So, and you'll be aware of that, because it's if you look at the run history for a logic app, you can see that it must be outputting its state at various points as it runs through. Each action must output state and store it, because you know that if it goes down, logic apps will automatically restart it. Now, one of the options I've seen available for logic apps on functions is stateless running. That increases performance, but at the cost of recoverability. So if your logic app goes down, you don't have the state, but you do get better performance, especially when you're talking about concurrent runs and things like that. There's not much known about how this is implemented at the moment, but it's an option today. But I think that for people where performance is key, where you're more interested in the lowest latency you can achieve or the highest throughput, and state is important, or you've designed it in such a way that you don't need state. then that's something that's very useful that you don't have today.
So a typical thing there might be that if you're picking up a message off the queue and you're doing like a peak lock, and then you do a whole load of work, and at the end of it, you then just you then destroy the message once you've finished. If you're in a stateless thing, you'd have to go right back to the queue.
Yes.
And that might be okay for the very, very handful of times that happens, for the performance benefit you get. So it's not, so it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have a really shoddy application that's flaky. It just means that you've got to really pay attention to what the recoverability scenarios is and what the recovery points are within that.
It's probably worth saying that this isn't state in terms of us in our application, but it's the runtime engine state. So is the runtime engine using state or not?
Okay, and okay, so what this means for logic apps? Well, so we've already said, so it means we can write and debug locally, we can deploy locally. So this paves the way, and I suppose the significant thing here is that this is paving the way for running your logic apps in your local data center. And again, I don't think we actually know anything right now about how that's going to look, but I think that's clearly a direction of travel, isn't it?
Very, very much so, yeah.
So again, it's kind of, we don't know what, in terms of a product, we don't know what it would be like, but very much a direction of travel. If you can deploy this on your dev machine, you can deploy this in your data center. And it's just a question of how that's going to be, how that's going to look in terms of
how would we deploy it. So that leaves the last question is, well, what do we think is going to be the deployment model for this?
So well, who'd have thunk it?
Feels like we're ramming containers down people's throats.
Which does sound quite painful, but they are kind of lozenge shaped, so they might be all right. So obviously the whole thing, and right back to where we started, what ties this together is that running logic apps on the functions runtime will mean that you're running containers, and through things like OpenShift or Azure Arc or any other Kubernetes that you're running locally, you've then got the capacity to run these containers locally, and then bingo, it's job done, isn't it?
Yep, just there, just runs. And in fact, the beauty about that is that, let's say I create a logic app on functions, I put it in package it up in a container, and then I deploy it locally, and it's working for a while, and then somebody says, hey, let's move to Azure. And you're like, okay, I've got a container, I'll just deploy that now to Azure, and there you are. Your same logic app, you don't have to change it or anything. It's now running in the cloud. Yeah.
And that's the beauty of containers. It's that portability. It's the fact that you can port. Your application your program code is exactly the same, no matter where you're running it, because you've abstracted your application from the machine that's running underneath it.
Yeah.
So that's that really helps us on this. Is there anything else we want to point out in terms of logic apps on DAPR? I mean, what does DAPR bring to the party?
So DAPR, well, first of all, it's not all uppercase, so that needs to be changed, but I won't change that now because that will make this reload. There's nothing officially known. So DAPR is going to provide events and gRPC and state. And what I imagine is going to happen is that we're going to end up with additional functionality for our logic apps running in containers that we don't have today in Azure. It's possible as well because DAPR has sort of connectors. It has the ability to connect to other systems. And I do wonder, so functions kind of does, but I do wonder whether or not, you might find that we've got DAPR providing some sort of connectivity into your container for your logic apps. I don't know. I don't know what exactly they're going to do. State management is definitely one of those things that it could provide. We could probably spend a whole hour talking about DAPR and running through a demo and things like that, but it's too early at the moment to see exactly what they're going to do with it.
Yeah, but we just know that, I mean, it's obviously going to be something big, but we just don't quite know exactly what it's there at the moment.
Yeah.
I'm just conscious, everyone, that we're kind of coming up to the hour now. So if we just rattle through some of the main parts. So generally, just recapping on what this means for Logic Apps. Obviously, it's a greatly improved developer experience. We are going to, we assume, and this is a speculate, but we think there's going to be compiled rather than interpreted. We think that there's going to be massively better performance, possibly, proper, maybe not high frequency trading type kind of low latency, but certainly the kind of low latency where we're talking in the milliseconds rather than the tens of seconds that you sometimes, or the seconds that you sometimes get for Logic Apps,
or the minutes,
or the minutes when it's a cold start. So significantly better performance. Now, and this is an interesting one that, when you go at the moment in BizTalk, you can put inline C# in an expression. There's no equivalent for that in Logic Apps. You have to use a function or something like that. You have to.
There's inline JavaScript, and they did talk about inline C#, but it hasn't appeared. But I imagine if we're running on the functions runtime, why not? Well, to tell the truth, if you're running on the functions runtime and you're calling another function, there's probably very little hit for that. But I imagine we'll start seeing something along those lines being provided.
Yeah, and that's probably more of a speculation at the moment, I think, rather than an actual official announcement.
Yeah.
Which is why we've got a question mark against it. But if we're compiling them, then why not? Oops. And sorry. So very quickly, we talked a lot about Logic Apps. What does it mean for the rest of the stack? Because as we know, the Azure integration services is not just Logic Apps. Things like Service Bus, the Event Grid, Azure Functions integration accounts.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, Logic Apps will probably be part of Azure Functions. Fine, we know Azure Functions will support containers. And again, this is speculation, but I would expect that every Azure offering is going to become containerized. So that Service Bus will be containerized, Event Grid will be containerized, and that you'll be able to deploy Service Bus in a container with your namespace. So I don't know quite how that's going to work. Will you deploy your namespace to a container running Service Bus, or will the Service Bus be provided by something like DAPR, for example? I don't know. I imagine it's going to be a container running the Service Bus runtime, and that you deploy to that. Just like today, there is APIM. So we didn't include this on the list, but APIM, you have APIM gateway, local gateway, so you can run an instance of APIM locally. It'll be something like that. Integration accounts is a really interesting one. I don't know what's going to happen with that because they're technically part of Logic Apps, and I don't know where that would go. I don't know quite how they would solve that. But integration accounts is a combination of storage and processing. So maybe they'll link that in with some sort of storage like DAPR or something else that's a sidecar for Kubernetes for your container, or whether or not it'd be a separate container instance. I don't know.
Well, certainly the processing thing is kind of taken care of. It's where you store your maps and schemas. That's the other part of it. Okay, just briefly moving on. So timescales. So this Logic Apps v2, when might we see this? What do we know of so far?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. They announced the preview. I wouldn't expect anything till next year, personally. At some point, they'll announce a public preview. They've got a private preview at the moment. At some point, they'll announce a public preview when they feel ready. But I imagine there's a lot of things that have to come together. If you're working with private preview now, you've got bits, but you've got no way to deploy them, at least not in an automated fashion. Plus, the other thing to think about is it's unlikely that Microsoft are going to re-architect Logic Apps to run on functions without also having them running on functions in Azure. So if I'm doing development in Azure today in the portal, that's running in, well, we call it V2, but that's our name. V1 Logic Apps is running on the original engine, not on functions. So I'd imagine at some point they're going to move it so that your functions in Azure are running on this as well. So there's a lot of work Microsoft have got to pull off to make this happen. So I don't think we're going to see anything until next year. I mean, we might be lucky to see a public preview at the end of this year. We might see an announcement, but I imagine it's going to be next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with all the stuff we've been talking about, you can tell it's a big job doing all this. It's not something that's going to be really quick. So I mean, just interesting enough, just so that everyone knows that Ignite, the big Microsoft conference Ignite is being held. It's again, it's an online conference this year, but that's next month. So maybe there'll be a snippet of information come out of that. Maybe not. It may be even too early for something to come out of Ignite. But Ignite is a kind of one of those big conferences where you get a lot of announcements, like obviously last year Azure Arc. So maybe we'll hear something at Ignite. Maybe we won't. I don't know. We just got no idea at the moment. BizTalk Migrator, that was promised for, obviously, like we said, for the autumn. So so we know that that's coming down within the next few months. But what does it mean for BizTalk? I mean, and again, because BizTalk's been a staple integration technology for the last 20 years, and there's been nothing else really from Microsoft. I mean, there's actually, that's not true, because obviously, App Fabric came along and then disappeared again. But there isn't anything else really that's been able to replace BizTalk, but Logic Apps running on premises is kind of the so really, and again, this is speculation, because the official position from Microsoft and BizTalk is that as long as there are customers for BizTalk, Microsoft will support BizTalk.
Yeah.
But I think clearly there's a direction of travel, isn't it? That all this stuff that's amazing in Azure, we're putting it all on premises for you. So the question is, and the question on everyone's lips is, what
will they containerize BizTalk? That's the question everyone's asking, Andrew.
Oh, I thought I didn't realise that was a question. I thought it was like, how long, what is the lifespan for BizTalk? And again, we can't. The official Microsoft position is that BizTalk will continue until there are no customers for it. But I think in terms of direction of travel, you look at all the sheer amount of effort that is going in to the Logic Apps and the Azure technologies, and then BizTalk is kind of just being kept up to date with operating systems and versions of SQL Server and versions of Visual Studio. So you can tell where the effort's going in. So although we can't put any sort of
a little bit, isn't it, nowadays? So there's a lot of things that you just have to. It was brilliant when it started. It's still brilliant, but nowadays, if I want to do integration, if I want to do integration with Salesforce, I have other options. If I'm doing on-prem to on-prem integration, it's pretty much the only option I've got, even though it's quite a heavy option. It's quite an expensive option. I can't do a lightweight integration with BizTalk, and there are certain limitations with it as well. But it's still, as a tool, it's brilliant. It's still brilliant. It's a very well thought out, very complex tool.
And it's and for the most part, it's very reliable as well. So it's still here after 20 years because it is actually quite a good product underneath upon it, but it doesn't really fit the modern kind of cloud microservice
not at all.
Paradigm. It's starting to look a little bit of a dinosaur in that respect. So so if you've got BizTalk, what should you do? I mean, obviously, one of the big things we're all about is migrating people off BizTalk and onto Azure Integration Services. So we would say that. Yes. But the question is really, it's around when and what's a good time for that. And I think that's really going to depend on whether, there's kind of, when you should migrate from BizTalk depends on a couple of things. One of them is when those existing when your existing hardware or applications are reaching end of life, because you have investment cycles and you have hardware renewal cycles and that sort of thing. So that's so those always give you pause for thought. But also you've also got to look at when you reach one of those natural points when you're saying, well, am I going to upgrade to the latest version of BizTalk, or am I going to migrate my app onto something more cloud? It's like, do I need to stay on premises or do I need to go to the cloud?
Yeah.
Because if your BizTalk app right now is end of life, and you need it to stay on premises for one of those reasons, whether it's data sovereignty or whether it's just because of some, that's the easiest way you can meet a regulatory barrier. You probably just stay with BizTalk right now. If you were going to go to the cloud, though, you'd say, well, I'll maybe wait until fall 2020 and get the BizTalk Migrator tool and then go into Azure Integration Services. But this time next year, that might be a very different equation.
Yeah, exactly right. You might go, well, actually, now there's a lot more choice here. I can choose now that I'm going to migrate if that suits me and my business. So yeah.
And the other thing that we shouldn't sort of skip over is that, you know, unless you're getting a massive educational discount or something like that, BizTalk is an expensive product. And
Yes.
one of the things that containers allow you to do is, you know, because you can get quite a high hosting density of containers on the underlying hardware, it actually does, you know, if you containerize everything, you can make a massive dent in certainly your infrastructure hosting costs, but also, as far as we know, we don't, you know, although we don't know what's going to happen with this in terms of pricing, but you can, you know, BizTalk, even just for the licenses and the SQL Server for the licenses, it's a big thing. And by going cloud native, you can save yourself an awful lot of money in your next investment cycle by going cloud native. So, yeah, that's going to be a big consideration, I think.
Very much so, I think. Yeah. All right.
So we've got a question from Andy, and he said, enough, we've got to Q&A now, which is awesome.
Yes.
Thanks for listening, everyone. So, do we think that BizTalk Migrator will take a dependency on Logic App's v2? So I'm going to stick my neck out here, and this is me speculating, because we don't necessarily have any public information on this, but yeah, we've just been saying that these Logic Apps on the functions runtime is probably going to be next year, whereas BizTalk Migrator has been promised for this year. So my guess would be that the migrator is going to go with the current version of Logic Apps, and then at some point probably it will have to be modified, upgraded to go to the next version of Logic Apps. But just simply because of the timescales, simply because the timescale for BizTalk Migrator isn't known, and the timescale for Logic Apps v2 isn't known, and you know, I'm just putting those two things together. I'd say we're probably looking at the version 1 of Logic Apps right now, and
I agree. I agree.
Just
in terms of timing, I think you're probably right. But also, I think it probably doesn't matter, because there's no way, if you've got existing Logic Apps running in Azure and they switch the underlying engine to be v2, then I wouldn't imagine you need to redeploy anything. That would happen for you. So even if the tool was using v1, for example, and you deployed them, then they would automatically be v2. And I imagine that there'll be some mechanism to containerize your Azure resources in Azure and then deploy them on-prem. So it's probably a non-issue. The only thing I would imagine would be if you wanted to migrate a BizTalk application to Logic Apps v2 directly. Now that's something I've got no idea. I doubt there'd be an initial dependency, simply because, as you say, timings. I don't think that Logic Apps v2 is going to be anywhere. I can't imagine that being publicly available till, you know, sometime next year. So yeah, you're right. It's hard to know, but I doubt it.
So that is all the cues in the Q&A that we've got. So what we normally do at this point is we announce the next webinar, and yeah, but basically we're going to announce it soon. So we're going to do something next month. We're probably going to have a couple of weeks off because it's been pretty full on actually doing these every 2 weeks. So we're probably going to go and have one sometime later in September. It may be a roundup of Ignite, or we may have another topic, but we're going to have a chat over the next week or so. And so keep a lookout, keep in touch with us. Either follow the Azure Integration Group website, or follow LinkedIn, and you'll see the next. You know, you'll definitely see when we announce it and what's coming up. It will be something relevant. It will be obviously another chance to you know, get some more Andrew and Dan banter, and
maybe we could ask people what they want to see as well. If there's anything in particular that people want to see. I mean, what I was going to say is you know, just to sort of round off today's session, is that there's a few things around all of this that we didn't have time to talk about today. So we know that, for example, Microsoft are talking about, they've got a tool called Buck. They're using the open application model. They're looking at something called the cloud native application bundle, which is a way of packaging applications. There's a lot of reading people can do. We've put some links on here on the webinar. We'll put some more links up on the website. There's a lot to learn. So it's an interesting one. So just to say, Andy's just asked a follow-up question saying,
yeah, that's a really good question.
And it's a really good question. Given all the features coming, especially potential for latency, is it maybe worth waiting for Logic Apps v2 before moving from BizTalk? Potentially, yes, but it all depends. I would imagine that the process of migrating isn't going to be flicking a switch and it's done. There's probably BizTalk is a complex product. So anything that Microsoft write, and I think Valerie mentioned this, Valerie Robb, the Microsoft product manager, I think she said that, they're aiming for a certain level of support. So there's probably, once you migrate, there's probably still a bit of work to be done. So it probably doesn't really matter by the time, in terms of people's timing and things like that, you might find that Logic Apps v2 is now available. But it is a good question, Andy, that if you want the lowest latency possible, perhaps you're better off waiting before you do that migration. I don't know. It depends on your scenario. I suspect that v2 will probably appear in the portal first. And when that happens, we'll see a dramatic increase in performance. Just because of the way it's an easy solution for the team, for the product group, I imagine, to implement. Well, it's not easy for them to implement, but they don't have to worry about the containerization and deployment and things like that. So it might be that you find that the performance comes sooner rather than later. But it's a very good question. I guess it does, as Andrew says in the answer, it depends how important it is to you and how long your project might take and how urgent it is that you start migrating.
But probably the best thing to do is if you had either internally within your company, or if you're a consultancy and you've got BizTalk clients, you probably want to start having the conversation with them anyway. Because the way that it takes time to plan, put a technology strategy in place, plan the programs and that sort of thing. So in some companies, you by the by the time you've done that, that's another year gone. So probably start having the conversation now, and then it just depends on what's the most important thing. Is the most important thing for you to take advantage of all the benefits of serverless and cloud native, so that you can reduce your operational budget, reduce your capital investment, and just go onto a pure consumption model? Then the time might be to do it now. If your priorities are that you've got a mission critical application that is really high throughput, really low latency, and you need to tune it to the nth degree, maybe you'll want to wait, but maybe you'll want to start exploring the options earlier anyway, in terms of what, because one of the things is when the migration tooling comes out, maybe what you'll want to do is to look at what that application might look like in Logic Apps anyway, and then you can start to sort of, then you'll be armed with a bit more information to sort of understand how that might behave. So it's early days, but probably best to just start thinking about it sooner rather than later, even if you're not implementing it straight away.
Yeah.
So there we go. We're slightly over time as always.
Yes.
I would apologize. I don't want to apologize for that because it's like extra value. But
20 minutes for free.
Yeah, and the recording will be available. So so check. But so you should be, everyone that's joined via the Teams link, you should be able to just see the recording again via the same Teams link, and also it'll be on the Azure Integration Group website. It'll be on the 345 website, possibly the FNS website. I don't know if you do that, Dan. Just stay in touch. So we will see you next time. Please keep in touch on LinkedIn, and in the meantime, if you have any particular burning questions or burning ideas that you want us to talk about, let us know, and we will feed that into the webinar series as we go on. So so on that note, it's goodbye from me,
and it's goodbye from him.
Goodbye. All right.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. All right, goodbye now.
Goodbye.